I only need to validate the valid. In other words, if they're saying things that I do not think are true, I don't need to validate that. I wouldn't want to. I could, however, validate that they feel terrified or threatened based on what they're thinking. So I could validate those emotions. Those emotions make sense given what you're thinking, but the thoughts themselves are distorted. And that's part of the art here, is our negativity bias causes us to focus on what we dislike, what we disagree with, and what's wrong. Validation turns that process on its head. It has you sifting for what's valid.
That was Caroline Fleck on Psychologist Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive and an upcoming book about misunderstanding. And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, this is Yael. A quick reminder to stay tuned until the end where you can hear my co-host post-chat with Michael. Also, a reminder that you can now listen to the podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on the POTC website or go to patreon.com/offtheclockpsych. And if Patreon isn't for you, but you want to help us out, you can do so by sharing this episode with somebody that you think might benefit from hearing about validation. Now here's the show. Caroline Fleck is a licensed psychologist, writer, and corporate consultant who has served as a supervisor and consultant for some of the most rigorous training programs in the country, including Dr. Marsha Linehan's program and at Stanford Medical Center and the VA at Palo Alto. She is a respected voice in psychology and has been featured in national media outlets, including the New York Times, Good Morning America, and the Huffington Post. Her new book, which we're here to discuss, is the first of its kind to make specialized validation skills that therapists master available to everyone. The title of this book is Validation: How This Skill That Revolutionized Psychology Will Transform Your Relationships, Increase Your Influence, and Change Your Life. Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. And, validation is such an important skill set for a therapist. But as you argue, and I think this is so true, it's a valuable skill set for everyone.
Right? Yeah. The ability to be able to say, hey, I see you, I hear you, and to know how to reliably land that message. What relationship wouldn't benefit from that?
Yeah. It's like our work relationships, our parent-child relationships, our partner relationships, our friendship relationships, all of them.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the motivation behind this for sure, because I had to get, a PhD in clinical psychology and then specialize in a very specific treatment, DBT, to learn this information, which should definitely be taught in grade schools.
So we're going to teach the audience today, and people should definitely pick up the book to get a very in-depth exposure to the lessons that therapists get. But what is validation? It is a word that gets thrown around all the time in lots of different spheres. And so people might have this sort of ambiguous understanding of what it is. But your book really clarifies what validation is and what it's not. So can you sort of start us off with a brief introduction?
Sure. So the academic definition that we use is that validation communicates, so it's a form of communication. It communicates that you are mindful, you understand, and you empathize with some part of a person's experience, thereby accepting it as valid. My little mantra in my head for when I'm trying to do this is, to validate, you need to show that you're there, you get it, and you care to some extent. And when done well, it culminates in this experience of the other person feeling accepted, in feeling seen or heard. And so those are the targets we're trying to hit when we validate.
And you dig into some of the science of why this is so important. And I wonder if you can maybe give us a brief summary of why is validation so helpful in our relationships, whatever relationships we might be engaging in?
So validation is the single most important ingredient in any relationship. And I am going to underline that, and I stand by that. People would say things, well, like, okay, please, what about love? What about empathy? All these other things. In the absence of acceptance, what does love mean? All right. So if somebody loves the facade that you create on Instagram and all the filtering that you've done to create that facade, that's not really you. And so we have to feel on some level that we're seen and accepted. And in the context of that, we are able to then experience deeper trust, intimacy, love, all of these qualities that we aspire to have in our relationships are really only made possible or are strengthened through the sense that we're accepted. In the absence of that, everything else feels kind of shallow.
Yeah. And so would you say that invalidation is non-acceptance? Are the two equated in your mind?
Yeah, I'm really glad you speak to invalidation, because as important as validation is for all the reasons I said, invalidation is like sulfuric acid to relationships. Okay. And that's not me saying that. Like, if you look at the research literature on really complicated, devastating disorders, borderline personality disorder, narcissism, depression, these conditions are significantly higher in people who come from families or environments that are highly invalidating. And so by invalidating, what we're saying is instead of accepting a person's experience, you would dismiss it. You would either ignore it or discount it or just say it's wrong. You know, you liked it. That didn't hurt. You liked it. The kind of some of those gaslighty type of messages where a person's internal experience is shut down as incorrect or wrong. And they feel in that moment not only judged, but confused. And that is what invalidation communicates. And then the effects of that are pretty well established.
I hope that listeners hang tight because I want to go through a few more definitions before we get into some of the hows and the whys and the stories, because I think it's important to kind of disentangle some of these concepts that are fairly abstract and kind of have some overlap. But how do we understand what the difference is between validation and empathy and sympathy? So how do we distinguish between those ways of approaching building relationships?
Really good question. So empathy, as per the definition I gave, empathy is a quality. It is a component of validation. And it's not just general empathy. It's the way in which empathy is communicated. So there's a way to communicate empathy that says, I see it, I understand, I get it. So for instance, if you were to disclose to me that you have a fear of heights, and you felt kind of ashamed of this, and I could tell you didn't really want to talk about it. And then I was to say, oh my God, so do I. I know exactly how you feel. Oh my gosh, like how do people do tours where they go up those elevators to like, you know, the 50th floor? And you would say, oh my gosh, I know. And there would be that immediate sense of like, not only do I empathize, but I get it. I don't judge you purely as a function of the fact that I kind of see myself in you. There's a kinship there. That is the distinction in how empathy is communicated through validation. There's more of this like, I don't just feel you, I get it cognitively. It's both like a cognitive understanding and an emotional one as well. So sympathy kind of looks down from on high and says, it sucks to be you. There's not that connection. The person is kind of at a distance looking in, oh, poor you. Right? It's kind of similar to pity at an extreme. Empathy and validation, on the other hand, come down to eye level and say, no, I get it. I feel you.
So empathy is really a core component of validation, whereas sympathy is not so much. And I think that's an important distinction. And I want to get into, in a little bit, this idea of like, what do you do if you really don't get where someone is coming from? Because I think that that is a skill set that you describe so well, and one that a lot of people sort of have this question, well, what if I don't agree? Or what if I really don't like what they're doing, or can't see anything that I can relate to? But before we get there, I wanted to talk a little bit, and you already kind of referred to it, about the history of how validation became such a central component of therapy. And you talk a lot about dialectical behavior therapy, but there's an even longer history. And even Marsha Linehan, the founder of dialectical therapy, credits Carl Rogers with putting validation really at the center of how we do therapy. But I wonder if you can sort of walk us through how validation became such a mainstay, specifically of DBT, and why it became so.
Yeah. So, I mean, Carl Rogers was a super interesting figure. Like back in the day, he represented this very person-centered, client-centered approach to therapy. And basically his thesis was like, if you hit people with enough acceptance, they will kind of self-actualize. They will find the skills within themselves to heal, et cetera, et cetera. And so he really focused on having this equal, loving kind of relationship with the client. And this was at odds to some extent with behaviorists, the B.F. Skinners, who really looked at like, how do we shape a person's environment? How do we reinforce them? What punishments should be considered to change behavior? And so these were kind of like, in my book, I talk about it being like a West Side Story situation. Like they each represented kind of rival gangs in like the cutest way, because they're all academics and there was never a street fight. But
although B.F. Skinner and Carl Rogers had this very like intense series of debates, but I think it was friendly-ish.
It was, yeah, especially by today's standards. But yeah, they absolutely went head to head and debated, and it represented kind of opposite ends of this pole. And eventually the behaviorists kind of won out, for lack of a better term. So we started to develop a lot of treatments. We then researched those specific treatments and had a lot of evidence to suggest that they worked. And those were your behavioral and cognitive behavioral interventions. And they just kind of took off. And so by the 90s, you know, when it came to evidence-based treatments in psychology, most were behavioral or cognitive behavioral treatments. And yet, there were still a lot of people that we could not treat. There were folks, particularly with a condition called borderline personality disorder, who we didn't have a treatment for. These folks were considered just untreatable, right? Pervasive self-harm, suicidality, we can't do anything with it. And it was in an effort to develop a treatment for borderline personality disorder that Marsha Linehan, whom you mentioned, got this crazy idea of like, okay, what if I go back to the drawing board and combine these two approaches? So instead of it being like either or, she took a real like both and. Let's work on behavioral change and communicate acceptance. And she took Rogers' work a couple of steps forward in that she didn't just preach that this was important. She then developed a catalog of skills and trained therapists in those skills, made sure that they mastered them to communicate validation, to communicate acceptance. And once they had done that, they were able to use those skills alongside more behavioral methods. And this is when things blew up in psychology. This was in the 90s. And like, boom, all of a sudden, conditions that we really had struggled to treat or hadn't been able to, we now had evidence-based treatments for. And that led, as you well know, to just a revolution in psychology. We started to see many more kind of mindfulness-based, non-judgmental-based approaches that also incorporated behaviorism. And yet, for some reason, that huge revolution hasn't been represented as much outside of therapy, I think. Like, you know, we still have a lot of books on like habits and positive reinforcement and like all of this behavioral stuff, but kind of some of the more revolutionary stuff, in my opinion, on validation and acceptance has not gone mainstream for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, I'm curious if you have thoughts on what the reason is. I mean, I think that we're so eager to solve things and we worry, like there's an anxiety, a collective anxiety that acceptance is equated to resignation of like, we're not going to change. But the science on this actually shows the exact opposite. It's like Carl Rogers has this great quote that I'm going to butcher a little bit, but it's the paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, only then I can change. And the science really compellingly shows that to be the case, but it just feels counterintuitive.
It does. In fact, when I was, shopping this book around, trying to find a publisher for it, that was some of the pushback was like, is there going to be an appetite? I mean, we know that books on changing people and influencing them and habits, those things sell like McDonald's, egg sandwiches, right? Everybody wants to eat that up. But like this idea of acceptance, even if it's a means to change, there was this real sense of like, folks don't want to necessarily get better at accepting people they disagree with or dislike. Like that's not something that there's much of an appetite for. And so that was a legitimate challenge. And I think you're right. That is part of it. Part of it is that we don't tend to prioritize communicating acceptance as much as like getting what we want or making things change.
And you make a strong pitch in your book that this is a way that we can be influential. Like it's the paradox. Like when we accept, we actually gain influence. So I wonder if you can say a bit about that. Like how can we wrap our heads around this motivation to try to be accepting and recognizing that this actually opens more doors for having influence, even if it doesn't perfectly predict it or guarantee it?
Right. I mean, one way to think about it, one way that, again, Marsha Linehan as a behaviorist thought about it is that validation is incredibly reinforcing. All right. Human beings need to feel accepted. There's a great quote by Mark Leary that I think I'm going to butcher, the social psychologist, that humans differ from animals not in our need for something like food or water, but in our desire to be accepted. And I think that is really true. We're kind of all walking around starving for this, and very few people can provide it reliably and effectively. And so if you can, you're holding on to like cocaine, basically, that isn't bad for people and will strengthen, as you said, help them kind of reach their potential and be better in their relationships. So there's no denying that it is an incredibly powerful reinforcement. And if you use it in that way, it can foster all sorts of change. Okay, but that would be using it to directly reinforce a behavior. I was just thinking about this with my daughter who like wants a smartphone because every kid, of course, wants a smartphone. She's 11, so she's definitely not getting one. But she and her friends will like put together these PowerPoint presentations to like try and sway us for stuff. Like when they wanted a sleepover, it would be like, these are all the reasons why we need a sleepover. And then like next slide, like we don't get to hang out that much during the week and this and that and this and that.
That's amazing.
It's cute, but it's not effective. Like the points that she makes don't move the needle for me. I'm like, I don't care. Now, however, and I've made this point to her, I'm like, you need to validate my concerns first. That's going to go a lot further. And so if she were to come to me and say, hey, Mom, I really want a phone. And here's the thing. I know that as a psychologist, you know the research on this so much better than I do. You can speak to the harms, the concerns, the problems. And I've really been listening to what you said. And I think these are valid concerns. One, that it will disrupt my sleep. Two, that I will have a hard time regulating it on my own. Three, that I'll communicate with people I shouldn't be or engage in behaviors that could be problematic. I see that. Here are the things I propose we do to try and like mitigate those risks. Of course, at 11, she would never use the word mitigate, but let's pretend, okay? That is so much more persuasive to me. Like I am actually going, okay, like you've really thought this through. By validating my position, I am much more inclined to be influenced by what she's saying. Right? We are having a dialogue in which I feel heard. I don't need to fight so hard to make all of my cases. I don't have to worry that she doesn't get it. Now, that's not to say I'm going to give her a phone. But I think as parents, we can all agree that that would be a much more kind of compelling way to approach the conversation. And I think that extends more generally. I mean, I know it extends more generally to a lot of other conversations we have.
Yeah. And you make the point that there's a lot of scientific evidence and field evidence that when, for example, like a hostage negotiator is trying to convince a hostage taker to make a different choice, that it isn't, pushy tactics that save the day. It's actually validation. It's this opening up of the dialogue of, I see where you're coming from. And I see this all the time. I specialize in couples therapy. I see it all the time with the couples that I work with, that when one partner can say to the other, like, I really hear where you're coming from. This is what I'm understanding about your position. That person is much more comfortable then stepping into the listener role, because they don't feel like they have to sort of continue to try to make their point to get it across. They can sort of relax into the listener role with the reassurance that they have been heard. And now they can more comfortably open up to being the listener of the partner who can now take the floor. And so it just lends itself much better to open dialogue and to really high quality listening.
Yeah. And these are not just even like our opinions. So the Gottmans used an approach, a method called rapport.
I was going to ask you about that. Just little fun tip for listeners. There's this thing called the boogie board, which is currently in my Amazon cart. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too.
I work with couples too. And when I was training in Gottman's couples therapy, this is a therapy based on John Gottman's work, obviously. I was like learning all these approaches. And, Gottman's work is like really impressive. It's like he can tell within, 30 seconds if a couple is going to break up just by listening to them argue, like all this stuff. So I was really excited to learn like his method. And one of their most effective interventions for conflict is one that sounded absolutely bananas to me when I was trained in it. And it was that they have like each partner, if they're in your office, let's pretend, and they're getting into conflict. And then you, as the all-knowing therapist, kind of intervene and you say, person one, I want you to write down verbatim what the other person said and then repeat it back to them to make sure you got it right. And if they say no, you'll just kind of fine-tune. No interpretation. Try and almost go word for word. And then you'll read it back to them. Once they say it's, close enough, you guys will switch sides. And I don't know about you, but I thought this was like a disaster of a suggestion for like how to intervene. Like, excuse me, guys, let me interrupt this regularly scheduled fight to give you a writing assignment. And here you go. And here, like, I'm not usually willful, but like, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. There was something so awkward about it. And so what pushed me to do it was these stupid little boogie boards that you can get on Amazon that are just really fun to write on. And then you press a button and it erases. I know this isn't groundbreaking. I know you guys have all seen and heard of these things, but they were so cute that I had to buy them. And when I did, I used them with my couples. I said, okay, you each get a little boogie board and you're going to write down what the other person said and you're going to repeat it back. And my God, if that isn't just about the most effective intervention for conflict that I've ever seen. And John Gottman based that technique on, it's called the rapport because it was developed by a man named, I think it was Anatol Rappaport, as a strategy for international conflict resolution. So like literally wartime interventions to mitigate conflict at that level. And the technique is a validation skill. It's the skill of copying, which is just to repeat what you have heard. No further assumptions, no interpretations, just repeat. And it functions, as you said, to have person A feel like person B hears them. So then when it's person B's turn to talk, they're more receptive to listening.
So copying is one of the strategies of validation, but I wonder if you can just kind of summarize what the levels of validation are, and then we'll go into a couple of them in more detail.
Yeah. So again, those key ingredients in validation, it signals mindfulness, understanding, and empathy. As you mentioned earlier, there are plenty of times when you don't have a full understanding. You don't see the other person's perspective, and you certainly don't empathize with it. Okay, guess what? As therapists, that's our whole job. People are often coming to us with very distorted thoughts or behaviors that are incredibly problematic. And yet, we have to be able to validate them. Again, based on what we've learned in the science, we know that there's no getting around this. And so what the validation ladder does, that's my framework for validation, is it has 8 skills that are broken down into 3 subsets. Each subset maps onto one of those key components. So you got a couple of skills that can help you communicate mindfulness, a couple more for understanding, and a couple more for empathy. The great thing is, if you don't understand or empathize, you can always just provide a low level of validation with those mindfulness skills, attending and copying. And here's the secret sauce. If you do those 2 skills successfully, you will cultivate understanding and empathy. They function to do so. They are designed to do so. So they do 2 things. They signal mindfulness, that you're mindfully engaged, non-judgmentally attending, paying attention. And they help you cultivate understanding and empathy. So that's where the skill comes in, is being able to kind of know where to start with somebody and how to kind of move up and down this ladder. So that's kind of an overview of the framework. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I want to ask about a couple of the sort of specific skills, but one of them is copying, which is, I think, not going to be unfamiliar to people. It really does kind of bring to mind this idea of active listening, where you just kind of reflect back, here's what I hear. But you just have to share that you offer in your book this Seth Rogen anecdote from his memoir. And initially, I have to say, I thought you were going to dig into the 40-year-old version example of him copying. I was like all ready for it. I haven't read his memoir. But if listeners will recall, most people have seen this movie by now, Seth Rogen's character gives Steve Carell's character advice on how to talk to women. And basically it amounts to just repeat whatever they're saying to keep them talking. And it's remarkably effective. It gets him a very attractive woman when he's been very ineffective with the ladies. It's totally gendered. It's got all sorts of problems, but it's where my mind went.
I completely forgot about that until just now. Like, where were you when I was writing this book? Fabulous. I'm adding it to my website as an example.
It's so funny. But yes, so copying, it seems so basic, but actually one of the things that I think a lot about, and you sort of said this, but like we often distort in our minds what we're intaking from what somebody is saying to us. And so when we're making an effort to copy back, like reflect back, here's what I hear, it gives us an opportunity to kind of check, am I hearing correctly? And if you're not, your speaker will let you know. And if you are, it feels great for them and it feels good for you to know that you're tracking well. And I wonder if that's sort of a part of why it's so helpful for understanding, is that it provides this like feedback loop of you're tracking and you get the positive feedback, or you're not and you get some corrective feedback.
Absolutely 100%. So it serves that function of refining your understanding. It does also inhibit you, if you're really truly doing this correctly, it inhibits you from making interpretations, which is what tends to lead us astray, especially like in conflict or debate. We start just focusing on our rebuttal or just attending to the parts that we want to pick apart that don't align with what we're saying. And so we distort the message inadvertently. And so copying definitely can slow that way, way down. I would also say, just for clarification, I think there's a version of this that folks often lean into, which is where they go, so I hear you saying you don't like tonight's dinner. Okay. And I really kind of caution against a lot of the preambles of like, I hear, because it can sound very dismissive in a weird way. So you want to be actually quite discreet with this. I mean, apart from when you're doing like that Rappaport method where it's very obvious. When I copy someone, I don't really intend for them to even notice it. It's just, I am just kind of repeating oftentimes the adjectives they use to describe something or the keywords. It's just this little, like, I'm attending to what the high level message of what you find important. Basically,
Yeah.
that's what I'm absorbing. And I'm just doing that kind of subtly, repeatedly throughout the conversation.
So yeah, I mean, getting to the high level pieces of what people are saying is far more important than doing verbatim feedback loop, even though the Rappaport method might have you do that. I often tell couples the example of, like, your partner could explain to you for 20 minutes about how rotten their day was, and you could just say, ugh, sounds rough, right?
Yeah,
like it can be that summary as long as it captures the essence of what somebody is trying to say to you. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is that doing the reflective listening is a bit of a risk, right? Because you could make a mistake. And as therapists, we are accustomed to it. And you talk a bit about how people like Oprah, like the best validators that we know of, often make mistakes, but they kind of roll with it. And the reason is we can't know perfectly what people are saying. We do distort the message because we have our biases and we have our internal experiences that can be distracting. And so when you do validation, it is okay and it's inevitable to make mistakes. And the goal is not to do it perfectly. The goal is to kind of move with the process. But I wonder if you have any advice for this experience of, like, ugh, I got it wrong and that doesn't feel good for me or for the person who I'm trying to help.
So I mentioned there's those two kind of mindfulness skills, the attending and copying, which are pretty straightforward and are kind of hard to screw up. You can have that, like, weird situation where you're literally repeating verbatim what someone said and they're still correcting you. In which case, I just do more of, like, the nonverbal stuff instead. But where we tend to start to get into trouble, or we could get into trouble, is with when we bridge into those understanding skills. So these are the skills that are intended to show you actually understand. You're not just non-judgmentally listening and engaged. You get it cognitively. And for those, one of the most powerful skills is one you alluded to, which is what we call proposing, or like mind reading, right? So someone tells you X, Y, and Z, and you say, oh my gosh, you must be really frustrated. They didn't say frustrated. You're making that leap. If you nail it, that can be great. Like, it shows that you're putting things together and you get it. At the extreme, like if you highlight something they didn't even realize, like, oh, you're right, I am jealous. It can have a very aha moment feel. That is the definition of an aha moment. It's when someone has helped you put together something you didn't even realize. And in those moments, boy, do you feel seen. It's like that person knows you better than you know yourself. Right? Similarly, if you strike out on that, you feel royally unseen because the person didn't get it. Right? And I think you're absolutely right. Those are the situations where we feel punished. We made this attempt and it didn't land. And now we feel awkward. We feel distance. We might feel judged. And you're right. I mention Oprah a lot in the book because if you watch her episodes, especially with some like difficult personalities, like Whitney Houston or some kind of just like really kind of eccentric folks, she'll often propose things and get them wrong. Like the guest will just be like, no, I wasn't jealous. I was happy or whatever. And when that happens, she, without fail, goes back to just attending and copying. And then she'll try again. And she'll try again. She'll strike out. She'll try again. When I was learning the validation, we used to have these videos of Marsha Linehan working with folks who have BPD. And folks with BPD, as you and many of your listeners may know, can be very reactive and very sensitive, understandably, to invalidation. And so she would get it wrong. And people wouldn't just like correct her. They would be like, how could you say that? How could you, like, really negative reactions? And boy, if she didn't miss a beat, she just dropped right back down to attending and copying. And without fail, she would try again. She would try again. She would try again. And eventually she'd nail it. And so you almost have to see people strike out and then try again to get a sense for the fact that this is not a disaster. Okay. It is so much more about your ego feeling a little bruised there And that's okay. Like, you made an attempt and it didn't land and that hurts. But like, you just go back to start and try again. You don't like slam the game board shut and quit playing. Like, that's the takeaway.
And it reminds me of this study that I often think about in the couples therapy context, which was a study that looked at how important empathic effort versus empathic accuracy was for relationship satisfaction. And what they found was that empathic effort matters a lot more. And so in some sense, by doing a proposal that just doesn't land, you actually have an opportunity to come back to your speaker and say, you know what, you're right, I didn't catch it, but I really want to, like, help me understand. I want to put in the energy, the effort, I care. And it's actually an opportunity, I think, to really like strengthen, to deepen your intentions, to validate.
I think you're absolutely right. Like, this is really, I'm having an aha moment here because you're exactly right. Like, there's this sense oftentimes that people are just like kind of humoring us. They're trying to be supportive, but they don't actually really care or they don't actually really get it. But when you stick with it and you continue to explore, there's a message there that like the other person is more important than the speaker's like personal agenda to feel like they did it well, or they check that box of, listening or being a good friend. And that is communicated with the effort, with the circling back and continuing. And the other thing I always say to folks is most people don't get offended by your genuine efforts to understand them. But everybody, like I said, wants to be seen and heard. And if you're genuinely trying to do that, they will genuinely appreciate it and recognize it.
But this is actually a nice segue into a question that I think is on so many people's minds in this day and age, which is, how do we validate, which, really does imply that we get where someone is coming from, if we think where they're coming from is just plain wrong and potentially immoral and uninformed, and that isn't how they feel? Like, how do we approach validation when we really feel like that is an uncomfortable place for us to enter into that communication?
Yeah. So again, I think back to how these skills were developed for psychologists who are working with folks whose thoughts and behavior is often very ineffective and often dangerous. And what we are trained to do is to find the kernel of truth in someone's perspective. I just need to validate one part of their experience. I can validate their thoughts, their emotions, or their behavior. I do not need to validate all of it. Like, my daughter is able to validate why I would have concerns about her using a phone if she's using this like fancy speech that I gave earlier, right? Even though she doesn't agree with me. She doesn't agree with the fact that I shouldn't have one. She can validate my response. All right. I'm a vegetarian. I'm a vegetarian for ethical reasons. That said, I see plenty of valid reasons why people would eat meat. And I can absolutely validate why someone would make that decision, even if I don't agree with them. But I only need to validate the valid. In other words, if they're saying things that I do not think are true, I don't need to validate that. I wouldn't want to. I could, however, validate that they feel terrified or threatened based on what they're thinking, if that makes sense. So I could validate those emotions. Those emotions make sense given what you're thinking, but the thoughts themselves are distorted. And that's part of the art here, is like you're sifting. Our negativity bias causes us to focus on what we dislike, what we disagree with, and what's wrong. Validation turns that process on its head. It has you sifting for what's valid. Okay. And you start from there and move out. So it's like the inverse of what we're naturally inclined to do.
So you're looking for what you can validate. And then I have sort of a sort of related question, which is, if you have successfully connected with somebody and validated the part that you can validate, does it make invalidating the invalid more powerful? In other words, does it sort of, as a therapist or as somebody who might be engaged in a debate, Do you have the sense that it gives you a little bit more leverage to explain why you disagree with something that you disagree with, or why you think a reaction or coping strategy is not a healthy one?
100%. Okay. So if I just focus on the fact that you really need to get out of bed. I know you're depressed, but like this is not helping. You cannot sleep till noon and then be on TikTok and expect to be happy. Like, as a therapist, I might be thinking all that when someone comes to me. However, if I open with, of course you want to stay in bed. That is what depression does to a person. If you deplete the brain of serotonin or whatever else, anybody would act that way. That is what depression does. And yet, if you feed that little depression puppy, if you give it all the time and energy that it wants to, eat up, it will get bigger and hungrier. So in fact, it's because this is why you need to change what you're doing. Does that make sense? So you have to see the validity in it because there's something that feels very real and valid to the other person. There's a valid reason they're doing this. And I need to speak to that if I'm going to also make the point that they could or should do something different.
Yeah. And I think it does so many things. It helps the person to feel seen and understood and accepted, but it also just helps you to understand the function of whatever is happening for them. So it helps you to be a better communicator and a better thought partner with them if you can see where they're coming from.
That's exactly right. And now we're kind of full circle back to behaviorism, because as behaviorists, we're always looking at what function does this behavior serve? Why are they using substances? Why are they having an affair? Why are they sitting in bed and being on TikTok all day? What function does that behavior serve? I need to understand that if I'm going to substitute in or help them develop a different way to meet their needs.
Yeah. And I think that is reassuring for the people who might see validation as condoning bad behavior, because that is in essence what we have to do as therapists. We have to sort of approach behavior that is unhealthy or bad in whatever way you want to qualify it from an accepting standpoint so that we can help people make changes. And this sort of impulse to sort of punish and just, say that isn't okay just isn't as effective. And so if we're just kind of thinking from an effectiveness standpoint, validation offers us so much more power.
Yeah. And a note on that, my expertise is in treating self-harm and suicidality. These are very high risk behaviors. These are not behaviors that I think are effective. I can, however, validate why somebody would want to self-harm, given that it has functioned in the past, perhaps to relieve stress, release endorphins. There are valid reasons someone is doing that. The behavior itself is ineffective in the big picture. I do not agree with this. I can see where it's coming from, and we need to understand where it's coming from so that we can find something else you can do that will meet that need. But the behavior itself is not effective. And so it's true, it's oddly the more high risk the behavior is, the more dangerous or threatening it is. In some ways, the more I need to kind of focus on communicating some degree of validation. There's one major caveat that I want to highlight here, which is that if you are a victim of abuse or abusive behavior from somebody else, validation is not the way to go in terms of how to approach that situation or change that person. You have to have a certain amount of independence, autonomy in the relationship to have that effect. So I don't want there to be any misconceptions. The only thing to validate in that situation is yourself by getting out of it or trying to get to a place where you can. The other thing is, if you just come at people as though they're wrong and they're bad, that's already probably what they're hitting themselves with the shame and the guilt and all of that. If I'm a bad person, I stand no chance of getting quote unquote better or doing better. I'm just bad. If I know that the person across from me doesn't think I'm bad, if they see something quote unquote good or human, if they accept me, then I have so many more options there, right? If you've pigeonholed yourself into this narrative that you're a bad person and others around you just keep reaffirming it, the opportunity to change significantly reduces.
Okay, I have one more question. And this one is a little bit for therapists, but I think also just for those of us who get a little self-conscious about saying too much about ourselves. You talk a bit about self-disclosure, and I think this is a really important topic for therapists, but again, also for self-conscious people, because there's this question of like, how much is talking about yourself too much versus how much of sharing yourself feels really connecting? And I will say, for people who are listening, you should pick up this book because it is so relatable and you share a lot of your personal self. And never once did I feel like it was too much. But I know that when I'm writing, I often get this anxiety of like, do people want to know about my personal history or my personal struggles? And yet when you read it, it just feels like, oh, I know this person. I feel so connected to them. And so how should people kind of toggle that line of self-disclosure?
I've always relied on self-disclosure in my therapeutic practice with my clients. I think it is one of the single greatest tools I have because it is how I show my humanness, right? Like, I don't want to be seen as above the other person. I don't think that is conducive to change. I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think it's true. And I certainly don't want them to think I think that, okay? And so there has to be some equality if there's going to be a quality of humanity in the room. And that is one thing I practice and endorse. And so if you're self-conscious about it, all you have to do is just, always bring it back to the other person and do so very quickly. But I do think that vulnerability responds to vulnerability. And if we want people to be vulnerable, we have to find a way to do that within limits and within reason, right? So that you're not like all over the place and they're taking care of you or something like that. But as therapists, we tend to go way far in the other direction for reasons that are often not very thought out.
Yeah. That's so well put and such good advice. I'm so sad that we're out of time because I would love to keep talking with you. But before we go, where can people find out more about you and your work? And just a strong recommendation for folks whose interest is piqued by this conversation. This was such a fabulous read. Congratulations on a really engaging book on such an important topic.
Oh, thank you so much. So the book's available wherever you get books, Barnes & Noble, Audible, Amazon, all of the above. You can learn more about me through my website, drcarolinefleck.com, where I do have the audio of me validating my husband as he's talking about Seth Rogen, using that copying skill. I'm also on socials, TikTok and Instagram and LinkedIn at Dr. Caroline Fleck.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was wonderful.
You.
This is Yael here with Michael to do a Potsy post-host conversation to share our musings about this wonderful conversation that I had with Caroline Fleck about validation, which, wow, this conversation was so fun and she's awesome as a human being.
It is really difficult to not love this book. This is one of the best books that I've read in a long time. And I know that I say this about most of the books that I discuss here, but let me just say that I listened to an interview with Caroline Fleck on a different podcast. Then I got the audiobook. Then I realized that the audiobook is so full of knowledge that I actually need to get a digital copy so I can highlight stuff. Then I listened to your interview, Yael, with her 2 or 3 times. So I am by now completely confused as to whether I heard certain things said in your interview with her or in the audiobook. And also, she filled up my to read and my to watch list. So after reading this book, I am now on Marsha Linehan's autobiography. And yeah, just a fantastic book and hilariously funny, laugh out loud funny at times.
Yeah, which is a gem to locate in this body of work in the self-help section of the bookstore, because usually people are quite serious, but she is a very, very funny writer. And if you like footnotes, you will especially find a lot of giggles in her book. She carries on a footnote conversation, which I found absolutely delightful.
So giggles is a good segue to a question that I have for you that, to the best of my memory, you're not directly discussing with her in the interview. This is something that I picked up in the book. So this is the work of Paul Ekman. So my connection to Paul Ekman was in film school, actually. So I was working as an animator for over a decade, and I had extensive training in acting as well. And the books by Paul Ekman were one of our main sources for like learning facial expressions and so on. And the reason for that is that when you have a live action actor, the actor will learn the scene, will get into the situation, will put themselves into the spot, and their facial expressions appear, for the lack of a better word, automatically. They get themselves into a sad state, and then their facial expressions and so on match that internal state. It's acting from the inside out. When I'm sitting in front of my computer to animate a scene, I can be as sad as I want to. The digital puppet in my computer is still going to be completely bland. So the question for us animators is, what facial expression matches the mood that's going on here? And that's when Paul Ekman came in, because he had these books and books full of photos of, eyebrows sad, eyebrows even sadder, and all of those finely tuned things. But my question specifically, because to this day, I still think I'm either totally unable to pick up on them or they don't exist and they're just some illusion and someone's trying to fool with me. Microexpressions. So I remember acting classes where our teacher at Hooks would show us videos by Paul Ekman, and then he made us like point out where the microexpressions happened. And I didn't see them. And everyone was like, "Oh, that's it. I was like, "Are you guys kidding me? Like, where's the micro? Where is that happening?" Until someone else spoke up and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not seeing anything. Yeah, what's this about?" So, long story short, what's this thing with the micro expressions? Am I just not seeing them? Basically, what's wrong with me, Dr. Schönbrunn? What's wrong?
Where do I begin? No, actually, so this is an interesting point that you're bringing up, because there's actually some controversy in the field about the validity of how universal microexpressions are. And actually, I would argue that Paul Ekman's side of the equation is losing to Lisa Feldman Barrett's side. And she has a really interesting book that I highly recommend. It'll sort of blow people's minds in terms of how we traditionally have thought about emotions getting expressed. It really kind of turns it upside down. So Lisa Feldman Barrett is a psychologist who has pioneered this theory called psychological constructionism. And basically, it came out of this research that reflects your experience, which is that there's this sort of widely accepted idea that there's universal expressions of how people feel. And early in her career, I think she was still in graduate school, she tried to replicate it, and she couldn't replicate it. And she started digging deep and sort of with a curious questioning of like, is this really true? As opposed to just assuming it was true, and began to discover that there's a lot more variation in how people interpret their internal sensations to reflect a given emotion and then how they express it. And so there are commonalities in, for example, how Americans might express themselves or how Japanese people might express themselves or whatever culture. But they're fairly culturally bound because, as her research shows, what happens is we have internal bodily sensations. It might be hunger, it might be sadness, and most things are on a continuum. And what happens is we learn how to attach those internal sensations to constructs, and constructs tend to be very culturally bound. And so what might be sadness in one culture might reflect something that we call something or understand very differently in a different culture. And so there actually is far less universality than we have long assumed. There's been sort of all these mistakes that have been made that have gotten accepted and then built upon. And through her work, she's really deconstructed a lot of how we think about microexpressions and just emotion in general. So it's a very interesting conversation. And I think a very important one when we think about validation, right? Because often when we think about validating other people, we're sort of looking for cues in how they're feeling or what they're thinking. We're mentalizing, I'm imagining that you feel this. Is this what you feel? And I think Lisa Feldman Barrett's ideas help us to be a lot more humble, a lot less confident in, I think, a useful way to be more tentative. Like, is this what you're feeling? And to sort of open it up for other people to inform you, yes, that's right, or no, like this is actually what I'm feeling. You're picking up on cues, but actually you're misunderstanding what they represent. And that actually gives you more opportunity to get it right? To be more tentative and to be more curious, as opposed to just say, you must be feeling this because I see it on your face.
When you started talking about how this culturally expresses in different ways, the first thing my mind went to is eye contact. Where, in the Western world, like hold strong eye contact, it's a good sign, but try doing that in some other cultures and you're not doing yourself a favor or the other person because, it's considered impolite or it's considered way too direct and so on. And then going and thinking, if I do X, then I will get Y is obviously quite faulty.
Yeah. And not to mention that there are neurological differences that might make eye contact, more or less comfortable. I was just reading Temple Grandin's book, and she talks about how it's reverse for somebody with autism, that eye contact feels very, very threatening. And so, the cues that we read, that we assume, oh, this is universal, are far less universal than we assume. And those assumptions get us into trouble in terms of making connections and being able to validate other people, because our overconfidence might prevent us from getting corrective feedback.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're leaving you with some more ideas to chew on. But as Michael said, this is a terrific book, Validation by Caroline Fleck. We'll put all the links in the show notes. It's such an important skill set, one that doesn't get talked about enough in the literature. And I'm just really glad that we were able to get her on our show. And we'll definitely hope to hear from listeners who have tried out validation skills that she talked about. And we'd love to hear how it went for you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.